Hi, my name is Brendan Graham Dempsey. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Applied Metatheory, where we're trying to bring academic rigor to the philosophy building and metascience that we see as undergirding an integrative worldview for the 21st century. This is a presentation on some findings important for integral metatheories specifically. All right, well, let's dive right in. I decided to call this measuring worldviews, putting integral altitudes to the test. It could have been called a few other things like updating or upgrading maybe the integral map. Some of the groundwork that had been laid with this approach of syncing up these different developmental models and talking about a complexification system of worldviews was sort of heuristically incredibly compelling, but I wanted more in terms of empirical rigor to this. And that set me on a path to try to deeply empirically ground these, test them, validate them, or falsify them, these models, and see what that looked like. This is sort of the map that I'm talking about, kind of the classic layout where Wilbur is syncing up all these different developmental models in these different domains according to these altitudes, which is this color scheme that you see on the left-hand side here. And by being able to basically line up all these different models according to one singular axis, there's this claim that, these represent some kind of deep structures, that these are getting at something that is real across all these different domains of investigation. And so by being able to make these connections, you could begin to see this kind of really big picture idea here of complexifying epistemologies, basically, that were being probed by these different thinkers in their different domains. So that's what I wanted to kind of put to the test. And in doing so, I wanted to see, how well does this map hold up once we start trying to get really rigorous in terms of quantification, measurement, and comparison, that sort of a thing. So I'm going to try to do here now is kind of zoom in on each aspect of this, each of these lines here, as it were, in this integral map, and then see how we might consider them today, how we might update them, how we might bring this whole map into the present moment in the most rigorous way. So we'll start with the cognitive line, as Wilbur calls it. And one of the first things that you see here is we've got Piaget and Aurobindo connected up together, with Aurobindo, the Indian mystics' levels of supermind and overmind stacked on top of the Piagetian stage structures here. This is a move that many folks in the integral scene have critiqued. I think I first, again, kind of encountered the issue with this in Hansi Freinacht's work. Daniel Gortz, who's half of Hansi Freinacht, worked very closely with Michael Commons, and he found that this to be, as he put it, a deeply confused move. But others in the integral scene have noted that this isn't quite the right way to approach this topic and have critiqued this. I think that the takeaway from that critique coming from multiple people is that we'll take off the Aurobindo and we'll just deal with the Piaget and see how this kind of stacks up. So then let's dive into how this is presenting these Piagetian or neo-Piagetian stages. On the left, you've got Piaget's major stages. As this gets refined and developed into the 80s, you see the emergence of models of hierarchical complexity, which are basically deeper, more fine-grained clarifications and updates to Piaget's major structures. And so Wilbur was already starting to work with some of these models as well, Commons and Richards, for example. But Fisher and Commons are basically mapping the same developmental spectrum through this model of hierarchical complexity. Now, again, sort of the imminent critique here, which this comes out of an article from Integral Review by Sarah Ross, who also was a colleague of Commons, basically critiques the way that Wilbur presents this in this map, saying that it doesn't actually represent what he calls a cognitive line. That's not really the best way of thinking about it. And of course, in some cases, it doesn't get fully accurately represented in terms of the placement of the stages, their names, and of course, the fact that Wilbur's mixing these different frameworks like Aurobindo and these different models to try to make some kind of point about a cognitive line here. So this is something that Ross was trying to get across, that this whole notion of line doesn't really apply to the model of hierarchical complexity, because the MHC is actually something more like altitude itself. It's a content-free, domain-independent way of thinking about development, and it's not a particular line of development, rather the way that Wilbur would present it. This model, also very important, has seen more updates itself even since the early integral maps. One of the most important of those updates has been the work of Dr. Theo Dawson, who's basically updated and operationalized hierarchical complexity and made it an even more refined scale, which is called the lectical scale. Now, in an article by Zach Stein and Katie Heikkinen, they actually make the claim that what the lectical assessment system, or LAS, really is basically an operationalization of Wilbur's altitude, that it's a way of basically measuring altitude. And again, that's the same kind of basic point that Ross was making, that hierarchical complexity isn't a line of development. It is essentially the domain independent, domain general measure that can be used to look at all these different lines. And that's exactly what hierarchical complexity, as measured by the lectical assessment system, is doing. So the beginning of this reformulation that I would propose here is an update, one that we basically take this idea seriously. We use the most up-to-date model, and we put here Dawson's hierarchical complexity as measured by the lectical scale. And I've added in here now those altitudes because this is essentially measuring altitude. Again, I don't want to present this in the notion that this is like just another line of development. That's what the altitudes are arguably getting at, is precisely this metric. So that's the claim that I want to start out with from the get-go. And then what I want to do now is, working with that supposition, all right, now we've got a quantifiable metric, a scale we can actually begin to use to look at these other models and see if they do indeed map to this level of complexification as it proposed here, and see if that actually checks out, which will be the way that we could either falsify or validate the basic map that we're looking at here. So let's start with Fowler's stages of faith. Basically, what we can do is look at Fowler's stage model through the lens of hierarchical complexification as measured by the lectical scale. Working with Henry Kurtz, we got 38 of the original faith development interviews that were part of Fowler's sample. We took out the interviewee responses, and then we had those scored on the lectical assessment scale, and then did some analysis. So when we do that, what did we get? Well, this is a lovely little chart showing the kind of trajectory of faith development as measured by lectical score. The basic idea was that we showed a strong and significant correlation between lectical score and faith stage. This was statistically significant, and what you generally see is, as you move, from lower to higher faith score, you see an increase in hierarchical complexity, and then you can begin to find complexity profiles for these particular stages. And so the big takeaway here is we've got this increase from like late level 9 all the way up to early level 11. And this is the first time when we can really see in very fine-grained detail the complexification trend measured in terms of hierarchical complexity and faith stage. When we rescore them in light of the structural information, then the correlation between these gets even closer, as you can imagine. So, this outlier here, when you read it, actually sounds much better as a level 5. These insights give us new ways of understanding the complexification of meaning making. And when we see the structural levels, these things kind of become clearer. Now, what's exciting about this, though, is that this begins to reveal what the correlations are then between altitude and, in this case, Fowler's stages. So when we look at 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're seeing late level 9 for level 2, early level 10, or in the early thousands for level 3, 1050 and up for level 4, and starting around 1100 is where we see level 5 showing up. So bringing this back to our big map here, and we didn't have any evidence or any data, I should say, for the universalizing stage, so we'll leave that partially blanked out for now. So the question is, yeah, right, does this actually map up in these terms? So we've got, well, yeah, actually it did. So the stage 2 mapping to late level 9, stage 3 mapping to early 1000, 4, and so on and so forth. So this actually looks pretty good. This is mapping pretty well. We'll give a check for Fowler's stages on that one, as that seems to have held up actually really, really well now that we have this super precise, quantifiable way of looking at this question. All right, well, let's move on a little bit. We can explore this next line, you could say, which is Gebser and his worldview structures, which Wilbur links up in this way. Now, This aspect of the study of the research that we've been doing relates closest to the project that we're calling the Cultural Complexity Index, which is basically using the same lectical scale, but instead of assessing developmental models, we're looking at texts across human history, sacred texts in particular. So what we did, we kind of made a couple of bins. This is, in a sense, deeply informed by Robert Bella's Religion in Human Evolution. The categories that he offers are the taxonomy, but they're very, very close to what Gebser's stages are as well. What we are essentially doing here is compiling a whole bunch of materials from these different worldviews and seeing where they map to hierarchical complexity as measured by the lectical scale. This map, which here are a number of forged oral tales that we had scored. We also looked at strands of like the early Torah, what are called J and E, and the kind of non-P sections of the Torah. Later Torah and some Egyptian literature coming now from more scribal, bureaucratic, agricultural civilizations, and sort of Greek literature. This was really interesting for many reasons, and I could get into a lot of details here. But what you're basically looking at is more complex social structures leading to increasing hierarchical complexity of meaningful texts. And so we're going to be doing a lot more research in this area. When you overlay kind of these altitudes here, you can indeed see that as kind of hypothesized, let's say in Gebser's stage presentation, you're getting these lining up essentially where one would expect them to if the map holds true. And so in this case, we can say, actually, yeah, these do align more or less in this way. And again, there's so much that could be said about this. The whole thrust or interest in this big project was this incredible claim that's been made by many, many people, not just Wilbur, but Habermas and other social scientists, that there's some kind of match between individual development and historiogenetic cultural change and the meaning systems that people develop over time. That link is the claim, but it's never been empirically tested before. And this research that we're doing is really, to my knowledge, the first to ever do that, certainly with any kind of quantifiable precision. So point there is, yeah, that checks out pretty well. Let's look at Loevinger's and Cook-Greuter's ego development stages and see how we can assess this in terms of hierarchical complexity using the lectical scale. To my knowledge, there's only been one other attempt or one other study that's done any version of this, and that is a 2023 dissertation by Aidan M. Thornton. He basically took the sentence completion answers for the ego development instrument, and he scored 171 of them, I think, on the lectical scale. And this is an image from that dissertation. Now, what you're looking at here are the ego stages mapped to lectical complexity. And what you'll see is a couple of things that I think are the most significant. One is, yes, there's a general trend of complexification here. There's also, though, a lot of noise. There's a lot of variance or variability here, so that if you're scoring one of these, one answer could score at, let's say, 975, and one could score at 1100. So lots of variability. That's not what you really want to see, obviously. You'd want to see something a lot more specific to each stage with not a lot of overlap. The other thing that you see is there's, yeah, again, this general complexification trend, but then this sort of like stagnation or plateau at these supposedly highest stages that should be even more complex. So apart from them sort of exhibiting a lot of variance, they also seem to kind of hit this ceiling around 1100 and didn't really break too far above that. So not looking great just on this study. Now, the other thing about this, though, that I was, when I discovered this, I thought, well, that's fascinating, but, maybe sentence completions aren't the best approach to trying to get at complexity scoring here, because they're very short, right? And so arguably someone's not going to be exhibiting their highest level of complexity in so short a space. One of the things that makes this inherently difficult is just the fundamental different methodologies between ego development theory and its instrument, which is a sentence completion form, and Piagetian style clinical interviews, which is what like Fowler and Kegan, which we'll be looking at in a second, use to get their data. And so that's kind of an incommensurability, and you have to do these kinds of comparisons. Now, what was interesting is I realized that having the Fowler data that I had, 19 of them actually had, those people had been administered the sentence completion as well. So I had 19 ego development scores as well as a clinical interview, which was the fate development interview. that I'd already had scored for electrical complexity. So this was a really exciting thing because now I had the comparison that I could make for the first time between a full length interview and the EDT scores associated with them. And that to me seemed like at least another, if not better, way to try to get at the same question. So what did those results look like? Well, here they are. So this is interesting. In some ways, these findings were kind of more in line with expectations. There wasn't as much variability. Of course, the sample was a lot smaller, but still, these made a little bit more sense and were a little bit more compact. Again, though, you see this interesting complexification trend up and then this kind of plateau. And I thought that was really fascinating. I don't know exactly what to make of that at the moment. Again, it's the same kind of ceiling around 1100 that these high stages aren't really breaking through. So I think more work really needs to be done exploring ego development theory in light of hierarchical complexification models. The takeaway here is that we actually do see the first couple of stages lining up with this. If you go back here, you can see the stage 6, which would basically be the self-authoring stage. That's showing up 1050 and up. And so this basically is matching for these first stages, but only up to a point. So I'm going to give this sort of a half credit, as it were, and because we don't have those highest stages validated in the way that we would expect according to this map. More work to be done there. All right, let's finish this up with Kegan and Graves. So let's look at Kegan stages. This is the constructive developmental theory. So what I did here was, because materials were not forthcoming, is I had the scoring manual that Kegan and LaHaye developed, and they give examples. I think there's one full interview, and then there's other just excerpts, basically. Now, the excerpts are short, which means that the scores for this aren't as reliable, but it's something. It gives us a glimpse of what these stages look like in terms of hierarchical complexity. This is what I found. Again, very interesting, broadly in line with expectations. These scores, again, aren't perfect, but they at least give us a rough sense of where these might be. We don't have any fifth order consciousness scores to work with, so that is kind of a question mark. But again, I would say that this generally accords with what we would expect based on this model, and there's a lot more I could say about that. We will blank out that fifth order just because, again, we don't have the data on it. All right, let's look now, finally, wrapping this up with the spiral dynamics data on the elliptical scale. So let's look at Graves' stages. Graves as well was not explicitly coming out of a Piagetian tradition. He was doing something rather different, informed kind of by Maslow and some other thinkers. He certainly made efforts to line up his model with other models, including Loevinger's, but he did essay prompts for his students, and he used those to abstract the major stages. And so we only have a few of them. Unfortunately, again, like data is rather limited here. So we only have what he quotes in The Never-Ending Quest. And he gives some excerpts there from, and actually some of them, I guess, are full essays, maybe. But they're long enough, at least, to score on the elliptical scale. And when we do that, what do we get? Well, here's what I found, which is interesting. Well, what do we make of this? So we've got the red. I'll just use the spiral dynamics colors for these. Red shows up in level 9 on the elliptical scale, but it also has examples of high or a low level 11. Similarly, blue has a very broad range. Orange is about in line with what else we've been looking at, and green is sort of kind of high for what we're looking at. But I think what we're looking at really is that this doesn't give us the greatest sense that this is actually tracking hierarchical complexity in any significant way. I mean, just again, looking at the red scores here, one is like 975 or so, and then you've got one that's like 1106. And when you read them, you can you can tell the difference. This is the one that scored in level 9. Basically, life is one goddamn great big jungle. Some they have got it to fight their way through it, and some they just don't have it. The grown up, he survives, or go down big, and he's got it. So that's kind of where that one is coming from in terms of complexity. Then you've got another one that's also assigned to the red, which reads, psychologically mature human behavior is that mental behavior that enables a human being not only to survive, but also to succeed and win over his environment, ... I mean, just kind of on the face of it, these are very clearly kind of different levels of complexity, these texts, and that is exactly what the data shows here. And so the fact that these are both just being assigned to red because of basically surface level content means that that's problematic. I would say, as it currently stands, the Graves data doesn't really hold up. It doesn't really match to this map as we are looking at it. So that all being said, what the grayed out sections here are basically what I would say, either needs more information or it remains to be validated, let's say. And if we kind of just take that out, we can see something like this is something you can kind of take to the bank, actually, based on quantifiable data. And I'll finish up now just by kind of gesturing to where I think this work is going. And it's something like using hierarchical complexity to think of these different altitudes in terms of the justifications that they're using to base these worldview structures on. And if we make hierarchical complexity a part of that metric, we can be much more robust and rigorous in terms of assigning these stages or altitude assessments to the materials that we're looking at. So I think we need to ground this in quantifiable data. The lectical scale is helping us to do that, and I think we're on our way to being able to, make this a much more scientific endeavor because of that. If these studies have been of interest to you, please explore the work we're doing at the Institute in these various arenas, such as the Cultural Complexity Index Initiative, already mentioned, but also the Fate Development Pathway Initiative, and a new Worldview Studies Initiative we just recently launched. So thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.